know, you were talking about, the importance of oral history, ethnography, and being able to narrate our own histories, particularly in the age of Trump. But I say it's always been an important, whether it was Trump or not, because part of what I see the oral history project at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies doing is taking our histories, taking our stories, and taking what we believe to be about ourselves, and taking ownership of it so that others won't be able to take it for themselves, misinterpret, without the empathy that's necessary in order to do that when we're thinking about history, or we're thinking about what it means to describe someone, their life, and their relationship to the world, particularly in the United States, particularly with colonial status, particularly with being part of a system of cis heteropatriarchy. And I'm hoping that I'm not saying too much in the beginning, but let me start with a little bit about what is oral history. So oral history is a field of study and a method of gathering, preserving, and interpreting the voices and memories of people, communities, and participants in past events. So that means oral history is literally listening to people share their lives, share their stories, and relating it to history, relating it to memories, relating it to their communities and how they see themselves as part of these communities, as part of this event, as part of history. In the oral history world, we believe that people are active agents in history. We live through history, and all of us are characters actively living and participating in that world. Slow down if you have questions. Don't worry if raise your hand. Like, what do you mean by active agents and participating in history? Basically, that means. What do you mean by active? Basically, that means, right, that a lot of us are, or all of us, right, are living in a world where we can and do and are affected by history, by the world around us, by the systems at B, by oppression, by power structures. We all believe, or we all share a space in this world, and we all have something to say regarding those things, whether it be a mother or a garment worker who migrated from Puerto Rico, because there was no jobs in Puerto Rico. They came to the United States, they found a factory job, and then they were able to bring more people because they were able to share a room in the project building, and they brought their cousin. So that's part of history, right? That's very important. It may not seem like, in the wider scheme of things, maybe that's not history, but it really is, right? Because we think about patterns, we think about who these people are and how important they were for bringing other people, and how it affected them, how economic status affected them, how jobs affected them, how colonialism affected them. And so it's really important to slow down and say, okay, this is the thing that happened in Puerto Rico, and this is how it actually affected people. I know you're reading a couple of great readings, one about soldiers, and another one about just the introduction to Puerto Ricans using a colonialist frame. Mm-hmm. And so I hope with the examples that I've provided that you can see what it looks like for people on the ground. But again, a little bit more about oral history, because it sounds a little bit complicated, but it can be very, very simple. So what we do is we interview people, oral historians. Is there any reason why people interview people? Anybody? What do you see interviews? Don't be shy. I see interviews on the news. I see interviews, maybe you're watching 60 Minutes, somebody's, giving in the hot seat, hey, tell me about this thing, maybe. The most common type of interview is like a job interview, right? Anyone done that? Yeah. How do you feel doing in a job interview? Nervous, right? In an oral history interview, that same type of nervousness exists. And so what we do as oral historians, we try to make the person feel very, very comfortable. And you were talking about being able to listen. And part of listening is having that empathetic sentiment, viewing the person as a whole person, and understanding that they have feelings, and that they are going to be comfortable with answering some questions, and they are going to be not comfortable answering some questions. And so, as an oral historian, we have to make sure that we treat the interview not as an interview that you will see at a job, not as an interview as you would see, say, on the news as a journalistic interview. It's a completely different thing. And what I specialize in is life history interviews. I love to always start from the beginning, where someone was born, and even before that, right? What about their parents, their grandparents, where they came from, just sort of things on how a person understands how they came to be, and then where they are now. So, yep.
Yes, now that you mentioned that you specialize in life stories, are there any subfields in oral history? And if so, what are those?
Yeah, so I specialize in life histories, and that's what I love to do. But a lot of times in oral history projects, life history interviews takes up a lot of time. My interviews can be 2 hours long and multiple sessions. I just did like a 4-hour interview with someone in 2 sessions, and we didn't even cover everything because I like to take my time. I want to make sure that the person has the time to tell the story with detail. So in oral history, even though a lot of it is about life history, there are some that are a little bit more specific, more targeted, especially if you're thinking about a particular event. I know my mentors in the oral history world, my professor, Mary Marshall Clark, was involved with the 9/11 oral history project when we're talking about the September 11th attacks. And they used also life history approaches because they didn't want to bring the subject of 9/11 in the forefront. And what I think what they did was amazing was that they talked about these people's lives as whole people, before the event, after the event. And if they wanted to talk about the event, they were given the space to do so. But it was more about who these people were. And so what I do is kind of similar. I want to see who the people are as people, and then the subject, if it's important to the person, it will come up, right? So I interview a lot of Puerto Ricans, and the subject of Puerto Rican identity comes up because it's important to many Puerto Ricans in the United States. And if they want to bring it up, I give them the space to do that. But as part of the Puerto Rican Studies department, I'm kind of almost obligated to bring it up, but because we're trying to relate it to the Puerto Rican experience. But sometimes people don't see themselves as that until they start talking about their lives. So I usually bring it up later in the interview. And you'll see an example of that later. If you guys are willing and able, I have an activity that I think will be kind of fun.
Yes.
Take about 5 to 10 minutes. How many of you are here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, there's plenty of us. So I wanted you to see what it might feel like to be interviewed and to be someone who interviews someone else. And so in an activity that I have, please pair up with someone. You can pick me.
Yeah, someone pick, because we have 7, so we're gonna need you.
Yeah, I can go in and so just pick someone, and then what you're going to do is one person is going to be the narrator, the person telling the story, and the other person is going to be the interviewer, the oral historian.
Melissa, do you want to go with him?
Okay, perfect. Okay, and so there are rules. The first rule is to let the narrator speak if you are the interviewer. If you are the interviewer, the oral historian, you let the person speak. It's a very, very interesting exercise. You're going to learn how difficult it might be. That means you ask them one question and then don't say anything. Right? This is just an exercise. Take about, I don't know how much time we have. Yeah, take about 2 minutes. 2 minutes, okay? So I'll be with you. Find somebody. Let's do this. Ask them any question, because we only have 1 minute, but make it about their lives, right? About their lives. It's okay to be nice. Put you on the spot. I'm going to be the oral historian. So, what's up? What's your name? Melissa. Hi, Melissa. Can you please tell me where you were born and a little bit about your
Rafael Maya, this is at Brooklyn College, the Department of Puerto Rican and Latino Studies. I invited Andrew Viñales, who's the coordinator of the Oral History Project at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. Now they are doing an exercise of interviewing people, interviewing each other and understanding what does it mean to do, to conduct an interview as a oral historian. I'm sorry about that.
So I'm going to ask you another question. Can you tell me, how old were you when you moved to the United States?
12 years old.
So you went to school. Can you tell me about school in Santiago?
I was actually a very good student over there. I went to private school. I was very involved in my school. Anything that came with your like
still getting my test. So it's like, that's kind of why, because I feel like education is very important, because it does like bring up I know. I don't know, I just feel like better education.
Do you guys want another minute?
Yeah.
Another minute?
Okay,
Okay.
what is your major?
Alright, so let's Sure. I was born in the Bronx. My parents are Dominican and my dad was born in
So they're still doing their interviews to understand what an oral historian does, and after that he will continue with his presentation.
She was pregnant with me. That made her U.S. citizen.
Yeah, I think that would be the
But she's
thing,
still
and then I
very
get
good.
some
So I grew up in Dominican, and Dominican you can understand that that's where I came from, that's where my culture comes from. And it was very important for them to give us something to us. That kind of understanding who we are. So I grew up in the South Bronx, in a community that was mostly Dominican. It was very hard to see. It was speak Spanish. But at the same time, it was very poor community. We lived in a basement apartment. I remember, I think I did my twin brother, myself, and my mom and dad used to live together. But I grew up.
It's like there.
With them going to college, they were both single parents. My mom said to my dad was 20. But his mom was single. That's a similar experience as a Asian woman. I always remember my parents giving me books that they were reading in school. So I read during the hours when I was there. When I was very young, this is important. I mean, this is a new college student. I needed to support kids. Maybe that was like 12 times. I don't know. Thank you. I've had practice. All right, everybody, I want to get back into it. I'm so sorry to interrupt.
And we
I
are
hope that
back.
was fun. Hey, everybody watching. I hope that was fun. So we did an exercise on interviewing each other, listening to each other. Hopefully we did a good job. How did we feel about that? Raise your hand if you were the narrator, the person telling your story, the person answering the question. Raise your hand. 1, 2. Okay, perfect. Okay, yeah, great. How did that feel?
It's kind of, wait, the narrator?
The narrator, the person telling the story, the person answering the question.
I think it's easy, but then at the same time, we can be the person to ask them questions about the subject.
Yeah.
So, like, when she was asking me questions, like, she was trying to, like, bite her tongue to, like, not say anything, but, like, it came out. And it's kind of hard to, like, not say, like, oh, I agree with you.
Yeah, so you want to be able to show the person that you agree with them or that you hear them. You want to validate the person's experience. Very good. And it's very hard, I can tell you, as someone who does it, regularly. Yep.
I think it was hard because when we have something that, like a connection or something in common, it's hard because you want to, like, if you share your experience, maybe it'll open them up more to
Yeah. Yeah.
find more things in common and how does that connect to you. So yeah, that's why I found it hard to keep off. Like, okay.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to tell you that not all oral historians practice the same. Sometimes when I do my interviews, I share a little bit, especially like you said, it might get the person to share more, to feel more comfortable. So that's great. How about the people who were the interviewers, the person who was asking the questions? How did you think? What did you think?
I was trying to kind of like keep track of where I was going with my questions, because then like someone else mentioned before, when she said something, I'll like connect and kind of lose track of where I was going with my other question, and like be confused and like, because I would be so caught up with like identifying myself and not like coming up with a follow-up question of, like, where I was going with the interview.
I hear that. So you're saying you're trying to both focus on what the person is saying, listening, but also like trying to take the interview somewhere, and that takes a lot of practice. Thank you for pointing that out. Anyone else? Yep.
I have a question. When you have these interviews, do you write it down? Do you record them? Like, how do you keep all that information? Because it's a lot.
It is. So some people take notes. I take notes when I do interviews. I try my best not to take notes on a computer, because there's nothing more distracting than an open computer, typing the click, click, click. So I usually do it the old-fashioned way, right? And I also do a lot of research before the interview, so I find out what I can find about the person I'm interviewing through social media, Google, academic papers, anything that maybe they were on the news, something. So I can get an idea, and then I usually do what is called a pre-interview. And in the pre-interview, it's more of a conversation about what the person might want to talk about in the interview, and what the person, or if there's any other questions that you might have about the person, so you can clarify. And then from the pre-interview, I write a questionnaire, which is kind of like a basic questions list of what you think you might want to talk about in the interview. Sometimes I don't go through everything in the questions list. Sometimes I go through everything really quickly, and so I have to come up with other questions. So it's a skill. It's a skill. So let me move on. I hope that was a great experience. But before I move on, which was easier, being the interviewer or the narrator? The person telling the story. Who liked being the storyteller, the narrator? Who liked asking the questions?
It takes a lot of preparation.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. But I think both are worthy. And I think you might be, if I understand correctly, you might be doing something with ethnography or oral history with your own families. And I think practice makes perfect. But when you do those things, I hope you look back into this experience.
Yes, and I asked them for next week to do a memory exercise to actually listen to the community they're gonna write about, and kind of like start writing everything they listen and everything they hear from people, to feel more comfortable with the, you know,
Yeah, absolutely.
you know.
Perfect.
So
So
we're getting there. In
you're getting
terms
there,
of
you're getting there.
exercises.
That's a great
to,
exercise.
to do interviews. Yeah.
Right. So when we do interviews, when we're thinking about memory, it's always important to understand that you're not always going to get everything perfect. You're not going to get everything. How you remember things is not going to be how it actually happened, and sometimes that's not as important than how it affected you at that moment and how it affects you later. So think about that, and also be forgiving. Right? Be forgiving of the things that you missed. Be forgiving of the things that you think you might not be able to express the way that you want it to sound. So that's great. So now let's talk about the different ways people use oral histories. People do essays, academic work, research, books, and doing oral history projects. Some people create art, visuals, documentaries. Some people look at oral history as a way of encouraging policy and lawmakers. They use oral histories to say, hey, this is a thing that's happening to the Puerto Rican community. We need to make a law to protect these people because this is happening. Here are some examples. There are libraries that use oral histories to collect the community's experiences and putting it in an archive so that other people can use in the future. Archives are wonderful, wonderful, amazing places. At the Puerto Rican Studies, or at the Center of Puerto Rican Studies where I work, we have a large archive of anything and everything you can imagine about Puerto Ricans and the Puerto Rican diaspora. Every book you could imagine. You have research papers, dissertations on the Puerto Rican experience. We have pictures of people who lived in the United States or in Puerto Rico, I don't know, over 100 years ago.
And oral
yeah.
history is getting a lot of attention. Actually, there's this workshop that is going to be held by the NYPL,
Yeah.
for example.
Yep,
you know.
yep, yep. I know the people at the NYPL.
Okay.
They're great, led by Alex Kelly.
And I want to ask you something, just for them to know how to use oral history. Can you talk a little bit about the work you did for your graduate?
Oh, sure. So,
yeah.
okay, so a lot of people in the oral history world right now are trying to come up with a way to get back into the oral nature of oral history. And so I played around with that. And I created an audio documentary based on the interviews I conducted with my religious family. I'm in Aborisha and the Lukumi traditions. And what that looked like was I sat around, asked my religious family, my elders, my godparents, my god-siblings, asked them about what it was like for them being in the religion and how they see themselves as participants in this thing called Lukumi, right? And then I took the interviews and then I did some audio editing. I used music. I used narration. I spoke over it. And I used the interviews to kind of bring those together. If you'd like, I can probably find an example of something that I did.
Are you going to present it again? Or
I
that
might.
Was just okay.
Yeah, I might be able to present it. I did some clips that I'll be able to present, and the audio documentary. I'm still working on it. There's something with copyrights and things like that, which is a mess. But when it's out there, I'll send you the information. But if there's time, let me see if I can go through this quickly.
What time is it?
It's 11:40.
Oh, it's
45.
We're good.
Okay, so if there's time, I'll show you a little bit, but I really want to get into the Puerto Rican oral histories. So, in thinking about oral history, we need to consider like who matters, right, in oral history, in history in general, capital H history. For a long time, people have this notion of history being written by the winners, right? People being written by those who won, those who were in power, and their opinions on what happened. But a lot of times, the history of the folks who lost, the history of the folks who are not in power, the people who are not necessarily in charge of what's being told, don't get a voice. And so oral history is a very, very great way of doing that. And so without oral history, I kind of trace back oral history to oral tradition. So us listening to our elders, listening to what they said about their lives that we may not have heard about on like textbooks. But in the United States, they have the WPA, and they did this great project where they interviewed formerly enslaved folks, and they were able to tell their lives and what it was like being enslaved people in the United States, and kind of was a document of what that experience was like. Another thing is without oral history, it'd be hard to analyze queer history, right? Because these topics aren't necessarily spoken about or haven't been spoken about prior to the 1960s. And so there were people who were queer, LGBT, before 1960s. So we listen to their stories and we listen to how they experience history and events. And so that's why oral history is really important. And when we're thinking about the Puerto Rican experience, there have been people who have studied Puerto Ricans, but not necessarily in a way that was deemed like respectful. I don't know if you're going to be getting into Oscar Lewis's paper, the culture of poverty type of thing.
I'm gonna mention it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we're gonna
So
go over it,
essentially, there was this person who did kind of like an ethnographic study on this Puerto Rican family, and
Yeah.
their conclusion was like, you put Puerto Ricans anywhere, the culture of poverty still exists, but they didn't do a good job at contextualizing what it means to be a colonized citizen. They didn't do a good job at contextualizing what it might mean to be thrust from one place, put into another, without any type of support from the government, without any type of support in terms of economic support, without anything like that. And so what happened with the Center of Puerto Rican Studies is that they thought that this was something that we needed to change, right? We, as people who are educated Puerto Ricans, have a responsibility to tell our stories and be empathetic to our lives and reimagine what success for Puerto Rican people look like. And so in 1983, the oral history component started in the Center of Puerto Rican Studies. And so in their imagination, they claimed that for Puerto Ricans, telling life stories is not merely passing down treasures of family lore, that is telling about folk tales of our families or telling about great heroes of the Puerto Rican people, but also telling about the struggles of our elders. They have a strategic immediate value, giving historical perspective to current struggles. So that is someone who is Puerto Rican, who understands that their parents worked really hard, from their grandparents who worked really hard, who may have came from Puerto Rico in a town where they didn't have much resources, and they come to the U.S. and they may not still have much resources, but in either place they did what they had to do to find some sort of mobility, to find some sort of success, and then how do we define that success? How do we figure out what it means to be colonized, what it means to be part of this economic system in the United States as almost second-class citizens? And I hope these next interviews that I'm going to show kind of demonstrate that. But first, let me show you the collection that we have here. This collection, so again, we started in the 1980s with oral histories, and those were audio, tape recorders. They had we have lots of audio interviews. But fast forward to 2013, we have the digital oral history collection on the website. It's available online. We have hundreds of interviews that's still waiting to be put up on the website. But this one started as the 100 Puerto Ricans project. And it's kind of a legacy project of Puerto Ricans who garnered some level of success and who are able to tell about their lives, tell about their experiences. So we have folks from all over the country. But our highest pockets are, of course, New York, Chicago, Ohio, Philadelphia, and Central Florida. But we are growing and expanding. I think pretty soon we're going to be sending some folks to Western Massachusetts, which has been growing exponentially since I think the 70s or 80s. And so we're trying to locate where Puerto Ricans are, how they create community, and what the struggles are like there, but also kind of a record of what we have accomplished as Puerto Rican people in the United States. And hopefully we're going to be able to do the same thing and reflect it back and go into Puerto Rico and say, this is what the struggles look like there, these are their stories, and how can we relate those two together?
Yeah.
We haven't gotten to that point yet,
Yeah.
but that's something that I hope to do in the future.
Yeah, and I think that one of the communities that has been like ignored is the community from Delaware and DC.
Yeah.
These people is like this. Now that you're talking about people that have achieved like lots of stuff, these people come to the United States with higher levels of education. You know, with master's degrees, PhDs. They are the engineers, and I think that it is ignored in the academic discourse, and it is something that Centro should look into.
Yeah.
Now that they are expanding, you know, the
Yeah.
scope.
Yeah.
And also in Delaware, the interesting thing about it is to see the relationship between religion and the Catholic religion and music. You know, they create these festivals for them to gather around those musicalities, Puerto Rican musicalities, in order to feel a connection with the homeland, and it's something.
I think there's a lot of
very
connections.
interesting.
There's a lot to connect with that, with what's going on in Central Florida right now.
Yes.
So a lot of the folks leaving and going into
Yeah.
Orlando and other places, Kissimmee.
Yeah, and something that is very interesting is that another community that is very ignored in the academic discourse is the community in Orlando.
Yeah.
Like, I know there are like theses and short articles, but it's like there are kind of like 1 million of Puerto Ricans down there, and you know, what are we doing? How do we talk about them?
Absolutely.
They don't have resources in education. They don't, you know, they don't speak English, for example, so they are the outsiders of the education system.
Yeah. So what we hope with the oral
down
history,
there.
so part of what we do with the oral history project is to kind of collect the stories,
Yeah.
but then like do the research, do something with it. I know when we first started in the 80s, they used to do workshops, they used to do community events, they used to reflect back and say, oh, these are patterns we find in the interviews, these are issues that we need to address. And hopefully we're able to get back into that practice. But right now we're really interested in just getting all the stories. And once we have a sizable collection in Orlando, maybe we'll be able to do that. In Delaware, as you mentioned, I think we had so with this project, they were nominated folks.
Okay.
And I think for us, right now, we are trying to locate missing pieces. Because obviously people were nominating folks that they knew. And so a lot of people were coming from New York, and we were like, but there's more than the Puerto Rican experience than New York. And so we found people in Chicago, we found people in Philadelphia and Jersey and Ohio. And so, filling in the missing pieces and seeing what we can do with those interviews.
And
But
I'm
I would
sorry
like
to
to get
keep
into the interviews.
interrupting. But you said something about showing to the people in Puerto Rico the struggles that we are suffering here in Puerto Rico.
I did an
Puerto
interview.
Ricans.
I did an
Okay.
interview of Diego Echevarria, who directed Los Sures. I'm not sure if you heard of it.
Yes.
And one of the things I
You have to
asked
watch
him.
that.
One of because this takes place in Williamsburg, so it's really wild in the 80s. And so one of the things I was asking was, what was the conversation like in Puerto Rico about the people who went to New York, and what is the conversation in New York about people who are in Puerto Rico? And so what the Center of Puerto Rican Studies is trying to do is kind of bridge that connection. They're having new programs, they're having conferences, Puerto Ricans conference.
Puerto Ricans ambassadors? Is
They have the cultural
that?
ambassadors program. They're trying to, so they're seeing themselves as, okay, we have these histories, we have this research, how do we reflect it back? And as a very important part of doing the work that Centro should be doing in terms of both doing research and making sure that people in the communities actually are understanding what that research means and making some action. So let me show you the archives, and then I'll show you some interviews. I think these are the highlights. So I interview lots of people. We have a team of people. We had a team of people in Chicago. We had a team of people in Florida and other places. And I just wanted to show you what it looks like on the website, and I'll send you a link. It's a growing collection. This is not all the interviews that we have. And so this is it. When you go into the thing, you click on the Oral History Collection 2013 onward. And because this is this particular project, even though we have interviews dating back forever ago, these are the ones that we did for this project. And these are video interviews. And some of them we used for documentaries that we're trying to make, or other profile pieces. And so we have this number of people that we interviewed. But I'm going to pick a couple of my favorites and some that I think might relate to who and what you're researching and studying. So the first one I want to show you is Gabriel Haslett Vieira. He's a professor. He was a professor. He retired, although he's still doing lots of work. I interviewed him a couple weeks ago, and I thought he did a great job at contextualizing Puerto Ricanness. But in this part of the interview, I wanted to show you what it looks like when we start the interview.
Okay.
And then the interviews are available online. If you're interested, you can look at them at your own time. So this is Gabriel. I hope we have audio.
Yeah, we do. I hope it's working.
Oh, should I allow?
Yeah, allow once. I think you. Yeah. Come on.
It's loading.
Is it a big file?
No, actually, it's still a video file, but it's not as big as it could be.
Okay. Maybe if you go to Mozilla Firefox.
Yeah, that might work better.
Yeah.
Let me go over there. Oh,
Yeah, there he is.
There he is.
Hello, this is Andrew Viñales
Can you
from
hear?
the Center of Puerto Rican Studies Oral History Project. It is December 16th,
Can you hold this for a moment?
and I'm here with the esteemed Professor Emeritus Gabriel Haslett Vieira. Very, very happy to do this interview.
Let me just
And
put the volume a little
I'm
bit up.
ready. If you're ready, let's get started.
I'm sorry I'm doing this.
So please, Professor, can you tell me where and when you were born, and a little bit about your early
Oh,
childhood?
really?
Sure. I was born in the old St. John's Hospital, which no longer exists anymore. It was in Brooklyn on Atlantic Avenue in September of 1941. And it was a long time ago, 75 years. And my parents were in the process of moving from my grandfather's row house in Bed-Stuy. They lived on Putnam Avenue in Brooklyn, 436 Putnam Avenue. My father's father had a row house there. And my parents lived there before I was born, and or at the time that I was born, they needed more space because they had a very small apartment up in the attic of the brownstone. So at the time that I was born, we moved to the East River houses in East Harlem, which was the first municipal housing project in that neighborhood. And we lived there, the family lived there for 1941 until we moved out in 1950. So I spent my earliest years in East Harlem in the East River houses.
So there's an idea of how it starts. I wanted to point out what we have on the archive. So we do extensive what we call metadata, which is we look at the things about the interview that they say, we summarize it, we tag it, we geotag it, so some of the locations that they talk about here are mapped on a map, and you can see all this information. If you're doing research, you can find it. I'm going to show one more because I think we're short on time. And I think, let's see, let's do, I think she's a fun too.
I think you have to open it and go to the,
right.
yeah.
Slideshow.
And do the
Open it
same
again now.
thing again, yeah.
And the housing and jobs and all these social ills that we started to understand as we got older. You know, all this came together and we organized, in the community for better housing, against police brutality, and in the schools we were advocates for treating children fairly. And I think all of this, contributed to my wanting to study bilingual, bicultural education in 1972. And that's when I graduated in 1973, and that's how I ended up wanting to become a teacher, because I thought a teacher and I still believe a teacher is so important, especially for communities that are poor, because a teacher can awaken the imagination, the creativity, and the intelligence of a person. And in our case, a teacher can present options and role models and ideas that keep us from internalizing those negative stereotypes that are so harmful. And so I've been, and that's what I did. I organized my own school. I wanted to have a school that was student-centered, that was bilingual, based on some of the prevailing practices.
So there's that. She, Ada Lopez, is based in Chicago, and she goes on to having an illustrious career in education on government level, and very important. And she started her career as an aspirante, someone who learned to be a community organizer in this late 60s, early 70s, as you heard, and kind of how it affected the community in Chicago. And I don't know how much time we have, but it's 12:06.
We still have 10 more minutes.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so I'm
Yeah.
going to show one more, which I think relates to what you were listening to.
Open it.
You have to do this very quickly, man.
Yeah.
That what you were talking about, or listening to, and I should show. Sorry.
I think you will have to
sorry.
copy and paste it again, yeah.
So you were listening or reading something about soldiers, and he's a veteran. Gabriel Haseviero is also a veteran. This person became a painter, and I wanted to show you his experience, kind of seeing himself as Puerto Rican and what it might mean for him versus other Puerto Ricans, particularly in the South?
Yeah.
But in the Army, I was 18 years old, and in the Army,
He was drafted. Okay.
it wasn't voluntary, like today. So I was drafted into the Army. I took basic training in Fort Dix, New Jersey, and then from basic training, I went to advanced basic training in Fort Knox, Kentucky. This was back in 1956. So I remember that camp in Kentucky was Fort Knox, Kentucky, and that was the armored division of the Army, mainly tanks. So when I was going into basic training at Fort Knox, Elvis Presley was being he had finished basic training, and he was transferred to Germany. So then right after basic training in Fort Knox, Kentucky, I was transferred permanently to Fort Rucker, Alabama. Fort Rucker, Alabama was an helicopter school, but I didn't qualify for helicopter school because that was for commissioned officers. So what I did was administrative work for the 2 years. Now back then, I was when segregation was still intact in Alabama or in the South. So we had recruits coming to Puerto Rico, and when we would go on leave to the nearest town, if you were, like the saying goes, if you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're black, stand by. So back then, they didn't have, blacks were not allowed to eat at the counters with white. The bus terminal and train terminals were segregated. I mean, one section of the terminals, the bus terminal, the train was one side for the whites only, and the other one was black. Now, we had a problem because we had Puerto Ricans that are dark in color coming to do business station there. But, okay, I had no problem because I was accepted as white. But these Puerto Ricans that were heavily dark or black, they weren't allowed to participate or mix with with our crowd.
Okay. I just want to show that for interesting reasons.
And
so, yeah.
we're gonna dig into Afro-Puerto Ricanness here in this
Perfect.
class. So yeah,
Perfect.
it's gonna be really good.
So and this,
Can you turn on the lights, Elisa, please?
in this section of the interview, he talks about like finally thinking about race and what it means, and how it's kind of how the United States is literally like imposing his experiencing race in a very, very different way than he was when he was in Puerto Rico, or even when he was in the North, because he lived in the Bronx for some time. So I hope you enjoyed these kind of oral histories. I hope you can kind of understand how they relate to some of your readings. And I hope that if you do implement oral histories, contact me for any advice. I'll leave my email so that you can contact me. I like to be of service, so
I
thank
would
you so
like you
much.
to do that because some of them are going to be using the resources available at the Library and Archives of the Center
Perfect.
for Puerto Rican
Yeah.
Studies for their final research project. So I'm going to give you a marker now so you can write down your email. But for now, I think we have